All right, we're continuing our saga of Ecclesiastes. Solomon, our Koheles adventure of trying to find meaning of life. We look back in Genesis at the Adam story. Adam and Eve were in the garden, they were in paradise, and for some reason they got discontented. They wanted to expand their knowledge, and they began experimenting, which resulted in sin and their departure from the garden. Solomon's at the same point. He's discontented with life. He begins to experiment. It leads to wickedness. And he has this toil and discontentment. Things have not changed. As he's written in this book, there's nothing new under the sun. And he writes in a very convoluted mess. It's a big plate of spaghetti that we've been untangling. And we hit the halfway point last week, and there's going to become a little more clarity as we move along. Again, he's looking at things under the sun. The sky was the limit for Koheleth. He never looked up. He never looked at God. He never looked, he only looked around. He didn't look up. And basically what he found is the same thing that we find. Life is beyond our control. And that he found that very frustrating. You know, when life is beyond our control, there are three options out there. Solomon only found two options. One option is you get frustrated, you get aggravated, and we've seen this throughout his story. He's frustrated with what's going on, he's aggravated, he's discontent. The other option is you seek escapism, and he talked about that at length. He pursued every pleasure known to mankind. He didn't know the word no. Anything that his eye sees that he desired, he grabbed it. And he was just trying to escape. What's the third option? Turn to the Lord. And that's what we do. When we look around society in general, we see the same discontentment. People are depressed, frustrated, angry because they don't have fulfillment and meaning. They're engaged in all types of escapism, be it chemical, physical, mental, whatever. And then there's people who are content because they walk with the Lord. And that's a difference. We don't have that frustration that Solomon did because we walk with the Lord. And that gives us more clarity as we look at this book because we know the rest of the story. So, again, he's from a very negative viewpoint. This is a don't do as I do. It's not a message of hope. The message of hope is found within the Gospels. Last week, we spent a lot of time on the vanity of wealth, and it seemed like there was significantly more discussion after class that perpetuated than in class. So, just want to quickly review some of the things that came up in the after the class session. You know, they talked about in the first section, Ecclesiastes 5:8-12, man can't be satisfied. But we see there, wealth brings its own set of problems. When you have affluence, it doesn't solve all your problems. The next section, we see a group of people who can't enjoy life. And he shows the analogy of being, we came from nothing, naked to the grave we'll go. And that's a stark contrast because when we're born, when we're presented from God, everything is obvious. That is reality. When we go to the grave, he said, we're going to be unclothed also. Because when we present ourselves before God, nothing is going to obscure the reality of our life. While we're walking around this earth, we're all clothed today, thank goodness. But we put on many costumes. We see the outward appearance of things. We see this appearance. And we know from people we interact with that appearances are not always congruent with reality. And that's why we hear this contrast between life, birth, and death. The true reality of man. While we're here on earth, we can fool people with our appearances. And we've been fooled, haven't we? But there's no fooling God. The next section, he talks about what is good and what is bad. And the pinnacle of this little chiastic structure is verse 20. Enjoy the moment. And from this section on, we start seeing some of the Greek philosophies drifting in. Did it come about because the Greeks copied him? Don't know. This is a Carpe Diem passage. Seize the day. Enjoy the moment. You know, my favorite verse is Psalms 118:24. This is the day the Lord has made. We will rejoice and be glad. We've all had times of adversity in our life. Life is not always pleasant. There are turmoils, there are struggles. Tragedy is the common thread of human existence. We will all suffer tragedy and adversity. Some people's lives are nonstop adversity. Regardless of what condition our life is in, it's the day the Lord has given us. And because we're with the Lord, and we look at Him and we have that hope, we have internal joy in spite of our external adversity. You have something, Mary? That's right. Happiness comes from that joy we have from being whole with the Lord and being one with Him. He goes back, he mirrors the passage of what is good with what is bad and talks about the bad things. And this begins in chapter 6. He talks about the miseries of covetousness. In our affluent society, we see covetous consuming people, but that's one of those thou shalt nots that's never preached on, and yet we see it. I think the pinnacle verse, though, is verse 2. A man to whom God gives wealth, possessions, and honor, so he lacks nothing at all he desires. Yet God does not give him the power to enjoy them, but a stranger enjoy them. To whom God gives wealth. Last week, when we were discussing the vanity of wealth, was right after Corey talked about his adventure in India. And he was in a region where we got to see firsthand the abject poverty that many of our brethren live in. And it's a very stark contrast. But God gives it as He sees fit. And we live in this paradox of our abundant circumstances relative to people within our country and around the world. Jesus told us the poor you'll always have with you, but you won't always have me. So we need to keep in mind that there's always been inequalities in the catastrophes and adversities of life since the beginning of mankind. And there will always be inequality. When we look at our timeline that we talked about in week 1, about 1500, actually some maybe 1466 to 1400, that's when the Exodus happened. So these people that are now living in affluence during the time of this book were in slavery. And they went to a desert. You know, the use of deserts in the Bible has always fascinated me because what do you have in the desert? You have abundance in the desert? You have the bare minimum. I've had the opportunity to spend extended amounts of time on deserts on 3 continents. And you don't have extras in the desert. You have the bare minimum, and that lets you focus. And that's why the Israelites spent 40 years wandering in the desert to refocus on what they missed. They had virtually nothing when they entered the promised land. Almost 500 years later, the time of David, they're going to be at the pinnacle of affluence. The country they're living in is not that far from us, the pinnacle of affluence. And then around 587, it's all going to come crashing down as they go off into exile. And they're going to be in abject poverty. So, our life is a moment, a blink in the timeline of history. And God gives us affluence our poverty, our blessings, our adversity, as He sees fit. And that's a challenge that we have as we go through this. Talks about, again, the mirror of people can't enjoy life. They can't be satisfied. And then he finally sums it up. And we get to the midpoint of the book, which is chapter 6, verse 9. And he begins moving into the next section. Basically tells us life is beyond our control. The first 6 chapters, everything has been about, I've done this experiment. I've tried to figure it out. I can't figure it out at all. I just don't know what to do, where to reach for. So he's going to give us 2 questions in verse 12. The 2 questions in verse 12, he's going to answer in chapters 7 through 11. He's going to take the rest of the book for these 2 questions. And these are 2 questions. What is good for man? And what will be after him? So he's saying, life is not fair. I can't understand it. What do I do now? And that's what chapter 7 and chapter 8 is going to be. It's going to be more proverbs, but it's not those little handy adages. They're interconnected. And then beginning in chapter 9 through chapter 11, after he talks about what now, he's going to talk about what next. And that what next is what next after this life. And that's where he gets really dark and despondent because he doesn't have hope. He doesn't know that there's something out there. So we're going to move into chapter 7 now. The key phrases beginning at this point, does not know or cannot discover. So he's confronted with the reality, I can't understand this. God has not given me the ability to understand this. It's beyond my comprehension. And he's humbled. And again, he finds it frustrating. He's the most knowledgeable man. He's got all the wisdom that God can give a person. And he can't figure it out. And he's frustrated. But he also talks about it is good or it is better because he's seeking something better in life. And he's trying to give us this contrast and give us some practical advice. So he's this old man doing this rambling narrative who's saying, okay, this is what I think you ought to do. Pay attention. And that's what we're going to enter in tonight. He's going to talk about wisdom and folly, the better than verses. And again, he begins getting confessional because he tells us, this is what I've done. But when he talks about these adversities that he discovered, he's saying, I experienced this firsthand. I erred. He doesn't always, the problem is he doesn't repent. We see from that. He's trying to tell us what really matters in life, but he said, there's going to be misfortunes and adversity. He also used a lot of homonyms. When we look at some of the analogies he uses, it doesn't make sense to us because we're not Hebrew speakers. But it was very clever and elegant literature. You know, I try to think of something that would be related in our language. And the best one I could find was, you have shoes with nimble soles. I have a soul that's anchored. So soul and soul have vastly different meanings and implications in that phrase. And as he talks about these proverbial sayings, he's using the same things. In the Hebrew language, that would be exactly like that. Soles on your shoes and the internal soul. But we don't have the appreciation of that. All right. First 4 verses. A good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of birth. It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. For this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, and by sadness of face the heart is made glad. The heart of wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. So he tells us right here, life is brief, and death is certain. And that's some practical advice. Now, why did he use this analogy? He talks about name and ointment again. Those are homonyms in the Hebrew language. But there's other implication. Remember, are clothed and unclothed? Naked you go to the grave? A good name is internal. It's your internal character. They lived in a dry, arid country. They would use ointment to moisturize, make a sweet smell. But what is that? That's an appearance that masks. That's something external. But when you go to the day of death, that good name, what's internal, is what's going to count, not the external things of life. Now, what was the house of feasting? A party, what's the most common party? A wedding. Okay, so that's when a wedding feast. So you have the two significant milestones in a person's life, a wedding and a funeral. And they're opposite ends of the spectrum. And he says, the funeral is better than a wedding. Why would he say that? Death brings clarity to things, doesn't it? When we go to a wedding or we go to feasting, we're celebrating something else, but we're not reflecting on our life. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning. He says, if you want to be wise, go to the house of mourning. That's a wise person's university. As opposed to the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. We've had people we know that have been given essentially death sentences. The doctor says, you have X amount of time to live. You have this many weeks, this many months. If you're told that you have this long to live, where do you want to go to? You want to be with someone who has wisdom? Or do you want to amuse yourself to death? Where's the advantage? And he sees that. We see the shallowness of people who do try to amuse themselves to death, and they will. And Solomon saw the frustration of that, of people amusing themselves to death. He's saying, always focus on death. There's more out there. A quote I use frequently is from Tim Price. And he says, it's amazing how many people wake up in the morning and don't realize that's the last day they're going to live. He sees that firsthand. We know that if we have that death sentence, if you have this amount of time to live, we have hope because we prepare. But when we go to the house of mourning, we reflect. And we're not going to amuse ourselves to death. The next verses, 5 through 6. It's better for a man to hear the rebuke of the wise than the song of fools, as a crackling of thorns in their part, so is the laughter of fools. This is also vanity. Thorns and pot, again, those are homonyms in the Hebrew language. If you've ever had a fire, you know if you throw some tiny little sticks, they flare up real quickly, don't they? Is there substance to them? Absolutely not. That's what the laughter of fools is. It's of no value. It says, you're a lot better off being criticized by a wise person than being praised by a fool. Paul in 2 Timothy talks about people with itching ears. They had itching ears. There are certain things that they wanted to hear. How many people like to hear compliments? We all like to hear compliments, don't we? How many of those compliments are genuine? How much of that criticism is really true? We don't like to hear criticism. But how thankful are we when we hear criticism that's constructive? Because people want us to be better. Because those are the ones that love us. So he talks about you need to be serious in your life. verses 7 through 10. Surely oppression drives the wise into madness, and a bribe corrupts the heart. Better is the end of the thing than its beginning, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Be not quick in your spirit to become angry, for anger lodges in the heart of fools. Say not, why were the former days better than these? Or is not wisdom that you ask that? So he's talking here about human wisdom is overturned by adversity. We see him always talk about bribes corrupting. Again, that was the most common way that people would gain wealth. Coin money would not come into being until about 650. We talked about wealth this time. What constitutes wealth? Well, you had stuff. But if you don't have coin money, you only have so much stuff. If you have more than you need, that was considered wealthy. What else made you wealthy? Children. People at this time looked at this congregation, they think Scott and Jenna Byer were the wealthiest people here, with as many children as they have. If you had abundance of possessions, you were wealthy. If you had abundance of children, you were doubly blessed with wealth. And what was the third thing of wealth that they considered significant? Now that's the stuff. Years. Years of life. And why were years of life important? Because you gained wisdom from those years. And they valued that. So if you were old, that was considered part of wealth. We don't look at that, do we? When we look at older people, and old is relative. Old is somebody who's older than you are. As you age, there's just more young people out there. It's all relative. But that age gives you wisdom that is not appreciated. But we see that. When we look at wealth all throughout the Old Testament, that's what their thought is. Look at Abraham's promise. Land, abundant, a nation, many children. Both of those implied wealth in the Messianic promise. So that meant wealth of these people. Our peers, as we look around society, they're focused on one thing, money and currency, not the internal. I think verse 9 really stands out to me. Better is the end of the thing than its beginning. The patient experience in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. How many times have you heard somebody tell of their grandiose plan? Every time we get a new football coach or basketball coach, they're the new hope, and they have these grandiose plans, don't they? I get to talk to young people quite frequently, and they're in high school. It's like, what's the next step for you? And here are these grandiose plans. How often are the grandiose plans fulfilled? He talks about how frustrating many words were, because people are putting forth many words in their idle prayers instead of deeds to God. Better is the end. What's the harvest? That's why I said, look at the grave. When we go to the house in the morning, we look at the grave. What's the harvest of that life? What is that legacy? What influence have they had? What character have they had? Right. A blank slate of unrealized potential. And what's going to come of that potential? And I think verse 10 is also crucial. Why were the former days better than these? Don't say that. We do. We do, but why is he admonishing not to say that? That's a very strong admonishment. It's not from wisdom that you ask that. We all look back and remember the pleasant times, don't we? We've had pleasant times in the past. We've had good old days and we've had days of adversity, but he says, don't relish those. Why? Because he's looking at the bigger picture. He's saying, number one, look ahead. Remember death. Remember there's going to be a judgment. What's your harvest? But he's also talked all throughout, and it increases as we get each chapter, the providence of God. God has providentially put you at this place, in this situation, with these resources, as he sees fit. So when you question, well, I'm at here, I wish I was back in the good old days, what are you doing? He's saying, you're calling God into question. God has providentially created this situation for you to be in. And this is where you're supposed to be. If it's pleasant, you're supposed to be here. If it's adverse, depressing, sorrowful, that's where you're supposed to be. That's a struggle. And has not changed throughout time immemorial. All right, wisdom can't lengthen one's life. So if you have money, you lose your money, you don't have resources to continue on. But you don't lose your wisdom when adversity comes. It's there, but it's still vanity. The wisdom can help you, but it's not the ultimate end all. It can't lengthen your life, no matter what happens. And then I think this is the turning point of this chapter. Consider the work of God, who can make straight what he has made crooked. In the day of prosperity, be joyful. In the day of adversity, consider. God has made the one as well as the other, so that man may not find out anything that will be after him. So he's been leading right up to this tipping point. God is in control. And we struggle with this because we're confronted with the perplexities of life. We are confronted with adversity and hardship, even in spite of our relative abundance. When we look around, it's like the old proverb. A man who has bread has 1,000 problems. A man who has no bread only has one problem. So, just like we saw back in chapter 5 talking about wealth, wealth brings its own set of problems in abundance. And we don't focus. We haven't gone back to the desert. Everything proceeds from the hand of God. The things that are true, the things that are straight, but also no less of the crooked things. So, does God bring evil? Does he bring wickedness? He allows it. Okay. So he allows evil. Why would he allow evil? Again, exactly. To be obedient, you have to have a choice. If you don't have the choice between obedience and disobedience, you're a robot. So obedience demands a choice, and he does allow evil. But what's going to be the harvest as we go through these perplexities? So we see that consider the work of God. God is at work in every single thing that happens. And he told us this in his prologue in chapter 1, verses 15. And he brings that back through. And Paul's going to talk about that in the Philippians letter. He talks about the crooked and perverse generation. But who can make it straight? Jesus can. So, the second chapter, or the second half of chapter 7, more practical advice. And in this section, he's going to talk about fearing God and about wisdom and about justice. And they're all aspects of the wise man, not someone following evil. Verse 15, for in my vain life I have seen everything. There is a righteous man who perishes in his righteousness, and a wicked man who prolongs his life in his evil doing. Be not overly righteous, and do not make yourself too wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Be not overly wicked, neither be a fool. Why should you die before your time? It is good that you should take hold of this, and from that not hold your hand. For the one who fears God shall come out from both of them. They believed in the law of lex talionis. As you sow, you reap. We saw that all through Job. His friends were sure that Job was punished because he had committed some evil. They viewed their wealth among the nations at this point of time as God being blessing them because they were doing everything right. But we know that bad things do happen to good people. And he says it, in my vain life, I've seen it firsthand. I know that. So he cautions about not being overly righteous. Don't make yourself too wise. What's the implication there? So don't be self-righteous. Don't be arrogant. So when you're blessed, if you do have these blessings, because you haven't been wicked, you have been wise, and you have followed God, how much influence are you going to have by being self-righteous? But he also says, don't be overly wicked. So does that give us license to sin? Does that mean we can sin a little bit? Is that what's going on there? He's basically saying it's the same principle as a little leaven leavens a whole lump. So if you let a little sin in, don't be overly wicked. Don't step over that line a little bit. Don't stray. Just like you don't go to one extreme being so self-righteous, like we saw the Pharisees and the Sadducees. He's saying, live a life of moderation. But don't drift back over, because it's easy to be adversely influenced. What were the two great commandments? Love God and love your neighbor. And he sums that up in the golden rule. How many people live by the golden mean? If my wickedness and my sins are just a little bit, they don't outweigh my goodness, I'm okay because it balances out. Does that really happen? Is there a golden mean that you can balance out? Don't be overly wicked. You can be a little wicked? No. The implication here, not being overly wicked, is that don't let a little bit in. Don't let that cross over. All right, verse 19. Wisdom gives strength to wise men more than 10 rulers in a city. Surely there's not a righteous man on earth who does good and never sin. Do not take to heart all the things that people say, lest you hear your servant cursing you. Your heart knows that many times you yourself have cursed others. So he says, we need wisdom because no one is truly righteous. Surely there's no righteous man. Have we heard that verse before? We've heard the New Testament, haven't we? No one is perfect. We've all sinned and fallen short. We all need God's grace. But there's a value in wisdom. So 10 rulers would be the epitome of wisdom in their mindset. But he said, if you have wisdom in God, that gives you strength, because these rulers, they're looking out for themselves. God wants abundance. you have godly wisdom, He's going to give you your strength. But you're still going to stumble. There are problems. But you have to keep focusing on being righteous. Don't take to heart things that people say. You're going to hear things, and social media is really bad about that. We see hard things that people say. We've seen in the previous verses where people talk about admonitions about being rash in your speech. And we see how that causes so many trouble. But you can't believe everything that's said. And how many times have we been guilty of the same thing? So, no one is truly righteous. No one can never sin. We've all fallen short. We've done it. But we always have to apply wisdom so that we are doing better. Verse 23, he begins talking about how human wisdom is limited. All this I have tested by wisdom. I said, I will be wise, but it was far from me. For which has been far off? The deep, very deep. Who can find out? So he starts getting penitent. He starts saying, I've been very frustrated. It's deep, very deep. If you're the wisest man on earth, how hard is it to make that confession? That's a struggle for him. All this I've tested by wisdom. We've seen the chapters of his experiment. He looked at science. He looked at nature. He looked at wealth. He looked at achievement and success. He looked at pleasure. I've tested it. And I can't find the answer because the infinite soul can't be satisfied by the finite. And this sort of begins his downward spiral as he approaches the end. He's going to begin confronting his own mortality because we can't find it, because when we approach wisdom without God, it's not there, is it? There's no contentment. And then the last verse, the most challenging verses. I turn my heart to know and to search out and seek wisdom in the scheme of things, and to know the wickedness of folly and the foolishness that is madness. And I find something more bitter than death, the woman whose heart is snares and nets, and whose hands are fetters. He who pleases God escapes her, but the sinner is taken by her. Behold, this is what I found, said the preacher, while adding one thing to another to find out the scheme of things, which my soul has sought repeatedly, but I have not found. One man among 1,000 I found, but a woman among these I have not found. See, this alone I found, that God has made man upright, that they have sought out many schemes. They said, I've sought to please God. I've searched it out, and I've been frustrated. The unique thing about this part of this chapter is he mentions God. We haven't heard God in a long time, have we? And again, when he mentions God, he's not mentioning Yahweh, the God of Israel. He's just saying a creator because he has drifted so far from the truth. But he recognizes God is out there. And he's getting this internal struggle because he doesn't have God. He's not very kind to women in this passage either. He has a lot of experience. Okay, he's got 700 wives and 300 concubines. So is he anti-female? He should be. You're not holding up your gender very well, Pam. He said, we've all sinned and fallen short. But he said, when I look at 1,000 people, I only see one good one out of 1,000. That's not very promising, is it? And he said, when I look at 1,000 women, I don't see any. Now, is that sexist? He was looking the wrong, exactly. He was looking the wrong wisdom. This is an example of parallelism. And again, just as we have one word for love in our language, and the Greeks had 4, they have different words. When he says, when I look at 1,000 men, he says, I have looked at mankind. The Greek word is Adam, just as in Adam and Eve. The word Adam in Hebrew is a word for all of mankind, all people on earth. So he's saying collectively, out of 1,000 people, it's rare to find someone who'll please God. A modern paraphrase would be, I've found a few people who please God. Well, not really. That's the way he would say it. So he's saying, out of mankind, I found 1 out of 1,000. But then he's going from man, meaning mankind, he's creating a parallel passage when he says, haven't seen any women. So it's literary license. It's not sexist, it's a literary tool. And when we look at the woman in 26, just like in Proverbs, he calls wisdom a woman. He's referring back to Genesis 2. He's talking about temptation, the temptress, and allurement, the bait of pleasure. So again, it's a literary tool. And this can be confusing when you don't look at the original language. So he says, true righteousness and wisdom are virtually non-existent. And we know that, don't we? Many will come to me and say, Lord, Lord, depart from me. Broad is the way to destruction, and narrow is the gate that leads to righteousness. There are a few righteous people out there. True righteousness, true wisdom is virtually non-existent. 29, God made man upright. Everything God made was good. But men have thought out many schemes. They looked at many devices. They looked at many explanations. They want to explain things away to make their actions conform to their idea of God, instead of conforming their lives to God and having true wisdom. Any thoughts about this chapter? We covered a lot of ground real quickly. All right, let's do a tangent, just like Solomon would do. Did Solomon really write this book? We think he did. The vast majority of people, and again, if you look at commentators, they never talk about Solomon as the author. The vast majority of commentaries always talk about Koheleth, which is what the author introduced himself, the speaker, the preacher. He gives hints he's Solomon, but many commentators say, no, if you look, and again, we see all the Greek thought that were in here. Today we see carpe diem, Valerium Malor, prepare for adversity, mementi mora, death is around the corner, prepare for death. We see these things enter in. They said, oh, there's a lot of things stolen from the Greeks. This is a later date. We're going to see parables and stories. But they say, oh, those came from the Greeks. Or did they steal from Solomon? All right, thank you.